Chapter 40. Wolfwind followed the river Semath all the way from the narrow sea to Castle Araluen itself. It was an astounding sight for the locals to see a wolf ship gliding, unmolested and peaceful, past their fields and villages so far inland. The many river forts and strong points, which would normally have denied such progress to a Skandian ship, now deferred to the fact that Princess Cassandra's personal standard, a stooping red hawk, flew from the masthead. A message had been sent ahead of the wolf ship's progress to make sure that local commanders recognized the standard and the fact that the voyagers travelled upriver in peace. It was also something of a novelty for Iraq and his crew. Finally, they rounded the last bend in the river, and there before them were the soaring spires and turrets of Castle Araluen. Iraq drew breath in wonder at the sight of it. Halt, watching him, was sure that, as well as the sheer admiration the castle inspired, Iraq's old plundering instincts were at work, estimating just how much treasure the castle could contain. He stepped close to the Obial and said softly, "You'd never make it past the moat." Iraq started in surprise and looked round at the ranger. Then he grinned, a little ruefully. "Was it so obvious that was what I was thinking about?" he asked, and Holt nodded in confirmation. "You wouldn't be a Skandian if you weren't," he said. There was a landing stage jutting out into the river, bedecked with flags and bunting, and a large crowd was awaiting their arrival. At the sight of the wolf ship, they began sounding horns and cheering. "That's a first," Iraq said mildly, bringing a grin to Holt's face. "And there's another," he said, pointing discreetly to a tall, bearded figure standing a little way back from the landing stage, surrounded by an expensively dressed retinue of knights and ladies. "That's the king himself, come down to welcome you, Iraq." "More likely he's here for his daughter," the Skandian replied. But Holt noticed that he did look a little pleased with himself. Evanlyn had seen the tall man now, and was standing in the prow of the wolf ship, waving excitedly. The cheers from the shore redoubled at the sight of her, and now Duncan was leading the way down the landing stage, lengthening his stride so that he was almost running, not content to stand back and preserve his royal dignity. "Oars!" called Iraq, and the rowers raised their oars, dripping from the water as the wolf ship glided smoothly alongside the landing stage. The Skandian crew passed mooring lines to those on shore, the two parties regarding each other with deep interest. It was the first time in memory that Araluens and Skandians had been face to face without weapons in their hands. Will, his face alight with the joy of the moment, leapt onto the wolf ship's railing as Evanlyn hurried to the entry port in the ship's waist. She and her father, their hearts too full for words, simply smiled at one another over the decreasing gap as the line handlers hauled the ship in to the landing stage. Then the wickerwork fenders bumped and groaned, and the ship was fast alongside. Svengal, grinning broadly at her, unlatched the entry port in the ship's rail, and she leapt into her father's arms, burying her face in his chest. "Dad!" she cried once, her voice muffled by his shirt and by the sobs that welled up in her throat. "Cassie," he murmured, his pet name for her from when she was a toddler, and the cheering intensified. Duncan was a popular king, and the people knew how much pain the loss of his daughter had caused him. Even the Skandians were grinning at the scene. Roughnecks and freebooters as they were, they had their sentimental side, and they valued the bonds of family. In the midst of all that joy and celebration, only Halt stood apart. His face was a mask of pain and misery, and he remained unobtrusively by the steering oar at the stern of the ship as the others surged forward to the waist. Duncan and Evanlyn, or Cassandra as her father knew her, stood in each other's embrace, oblivious to those around them. Will, scanning the crowd, saw a heavily built form in the ranks behind the king, a middle-aged man who was waving enthusiastically at him, shouting his name. "Will! Welcome home, boy! Welcome home!" For a moment, Will was puzzled. Then he recognized Baron Arold, a man who for years had been a stern-faced figure of authority. Now here he was, waving and yelling like a schoolboy on holiday. Will dropped lightly to the planks of the landing stage and made his way through the crowds of well-wishers to the Baron. He began to make a formal bow when the Baron grabbed his hand and started pumping it enthusiastically. "Never mind that. Welcome home, lad, and well done, well done. My God, I thought we'd never see you again. Wasn't that right, Rodney?" He spoke this last to the mail-clad knight beside him, and Will recognized Sir Rodney, head of the battle school at Castle Redmont. He realized that the knight was anxiously scanning the faces on the deck of the wolf ship. Yes, my lord," he agreed distractedly. Then he seized Will's other arm and said urgently, "Will, I thought Horace was with you. Don't tell me something's happened to him." Puzzled, Will looked to where Horace was shaking hands with the Skandian crew, farewelling friends among them before he came to shore. "That's him there." He pointed Horace out for Sir Rodney and had the satisfaction of seeing the knight's jaw drop. "My God, he's turned into a giant," he gasped. Then Horace recognized his mentor and marched briskly through the crowd, coming to attention and saluting, his fist to his right breast. "Apprentice Horace reporting, Battlemaster. Permission to return to duty, sir," he said crisply. Coming to attention himself, Rodney returned the salute. "Permission granted, Apprentice." Then, formalities over, he seized the muscular apprentice in a bear hug and danced him around a few undignified steps, all the while crying, "Damn me, boy, but you've done us all proud. And when in the devil did you get so tall?" Again, the crowd cheered with delight. Then, all at once, a silence fell over them, and Will turned to see the reason. Irak Starfollower, Oberjarl of the Skandians, was stepping ashore. Instinctively, those nearest him drew back a little. Old habits died hard. Will, not wishing to see his friend insulted, started forward impulsively, but there was one other in the crowd who was quicker off the mark. Duncan, King of Araluen, stepped forward to greet his Skandian counterpart, his hand extended in friendship. "Welcome to Araluen, Oberjarl," he said, "and thank you for bringing my daughter safely home." And with that, the two leaders shook hands. Then the cheering started again, this time for Irak and his crew, so that the Skandians looked about them with delight. And that, thought Will, was going to make it a little harder for them to raid here again in the years to come. Duncan let the cheering go on for a little while, then held up his hand for silence. He scanned the faces on the deck. Then, not seeing the one he looked for, he let his gaze switch to the wolf ship. "Halt," he said softly, finally seeing him, wrapped as ever in his ranger's cloak, and standing alone by the great steering oar. The king held out a hand and gestured to the dock. "Come ashore, Halt. You're home." But Halt stood awkwardly, unable to mask the sadness that he felt. His voice broke as he began to speak, and he gathered himself and started again. Your Majesty, the year of banishment still has 3 weeks to run, he said at last. A low buzz of comment ran through the crowd. Will, unable to restrain himself, reacted in total surprise. Banishment? You were banished? He said incredulously. He looked at the king. It was unthinkable that Halt, with his unswerving loyalty to Araluen and its people, should be banished. Why? He said. The word hung in the air. Duncan shook his head, dismissing the matter. A few incautious words, that was all. He was drunk, and we've all forgiven what he said, and I forgive him, so for God's sake, man, come ashore. But Halt remained where he was. Your Majesty, nothing would make me happier, but you must uphold the law, he said in a low voice. Then another speaker chimed in, Lord Anthony, the King's Chamberlain. Halt is right, Your Majesty, he said. Anthony was a well-meaning man, but he tended to be a little pedantic when it came to interpreting the law. After all, he did say you were the issue of an encounter between your father and a travelling hatcha-hatcha dancer. There was a gasp of horror from the crowd. Duncan, smiling thinly, said through gritted teeth, Thank you for reminding us all, Anthony. But then a peal of helpless laughter rang out, and Princess Cassandra doubled over, hooting in a most unroyal fashion. Every eye turned to her, and slowly she recovered enough to speak. I'm so sorry, everyone, but if you ever knew my grandmother, you'd understand why my grandfather might have been tempted. Grandma had a face like a robber's dog, and a temperament to match it. Cassie, her father said in his most disapproving tone, but she was holding her sides and laughing again, and he couldn't keep a smile from forming at his lips. Then he felt Lord Anthony's disapproving stare on him, and he recovered, nudging Cassandra until her laughter subsided into a series of choked snuffles and snorts. The laughter had been infectious, however, and it took a while for the assembled crowd to come to order. Throughout all this, Halt remained standing stiffly on the deck of the wolf ship. Duncan turned to his chamberlain and said, in his most reasoning tone, Surely, Anthony, it's within my powers to pardon Halt for the last 3 weeks of his sentence. But Anthony frowned and shook his head. It would be most irregular, Your Majesty, he said heavily. Such a thing would set unfortunate precedents in the law. King Duncan, boomed Iraq, and instantly he had the attention of everyone there. He realised he'd spoken a little more forcibly than he'd intended. He was still getting the hang of these formal occasions. Now, he continued at a more moderate level. Perhaps I could request that you grant this pardon, as a gesture of goodwill to seal the treaty between our two countries. Good thinking, muttered Duncan. He turned quickly to Lord Anthony. Well, he said. The Chamberlain pursed his lips thoughtfully. It was never his wish to deny the king what he wanted. He merely tried to do his duty and uphold the law. Now he saw a loophole and seized upon it gratefully. Such a request wouldn't set any precedents, Your Majesty, he said, and this is a very special occasion, after all. So be it, said Duncan quickly, and turned to face the figure on the wolf ship. All right, Halt, you're pardoned. So for God's sakes come ashore and let's have a drink to celebrate. Halt, tears in his eyes, set foot on Araluen soil once more, after 11 months and 5 days of banishment. As he came ashore to the renewed cheers of the crowd, those around him saw another man dressed in a grey-green cloak, who slipped forward and pressed something into his hand. "You might be needing this again," said Crowley, Commandant of the Ranger Corps. And when Halt looked down, he saw a thin chain in his hand, with a silver Oakleaf insignia on it. And then he knew he was really home.